Look at the way his hands move. That was the thought, precise, unhurried, wrong feeling in the way the important things always were, that crossed Dara Nolen's mind 6 minutes before Vice Admiral Kessler reached for his water glass. She was standing near the far wall, back against the wood paneling, trauma kit over one shoulder, expression assembled into the practiced neutrality of a hospital corpsman, doing what hospital corpsmen do at dinners like this one. Nothing, mostly. Be present. Be invisible. Be available if someone chokes on the salmon. Harwick stood at the head of the table, arranging the glassware the way the head caterer had already arranged it once. His movement was smooth and apologetic-looking, the kind of adjustment that reads as helpfulness if you're not watching his hand specifically. His right hand drifted across the rim of the Admiral's water glass for exactly half a second longer than it needed to. A brushing motion. Light enough to mean nothing to anyone who hadn't spent 6 years watching rooms, the way rooms need to be watched when your life and someone else's depend entirely on what you don't miss. That half second sat wrong in Dara's stomach. 23 minutes later, she would walk to the center of the room, interrupt a toast, and say something that would end 4 years of careful silence and change the shape of an evening that someone in a building far from this one had spent months arranging. She told herself she didn't know yet if she was ready. Her hands, hanging easy at her sides, had already decided. Welcome to Hidden Badges Stories, where the people protecting the room aren't always the ones carrying the credentials. Hit like if quiet heroes get you every time, subscribe so you don't miss the next one, and tell us in the comments where in the world you're listening from. The Officers' Club dining room at Naval Air Station North Island had been rearranged for a procurement dinner, not a celebration. Long tables, low light, white linen pressed flat, the harbor visible through the floor-to-soiling glass in the last gray stretch of a San Diego evening. Somewhere out there, a destroyer sat in dock with a sonar gap it couldn't close, and somewhere in this room tonight, the people responsible for closing it were deciding whether to trust each other enough to sign their names. Dara had been assigned here 4 years ago, Hospital Corpsman, Naval Medical Center San Diego, on rotation for diplomatic medical support whenever the base hosted events that required someone in the room who could keep a flag officer alive if his heart disagreed with the fish course. She was good at the job. She had trained herself to be good at jobs that required nothing from her except competence and silence. Vice Admiral Kessler sat at the center of the long table, silver-haired, broad across the shoulders, the kind of man who had spent 40 years moving through rooms exactly like this one and had stopped noticing the furniture. He commanded the Pacific Fleet's Technology Acquisition Division. Tonight, he was hosting Admiral Tanaka and Commodore Mori of the Japan Maritime Self-Defense Force, 2 men who had flown in from Yokosuka to sign a joint agreement on a submarine detection array that both governments had been negotiating for the better part of 2 years. $640 million. Technology that would change what Pacific Fleet submarines could hear, and how far. The kind of contract that only happened when people trusted each other completely. Harwick stood near the Admiral's right shoulder, a tall, lean man in a dark suit, his Japanese flawless and his English even better, which was why Pacific Fleet Command had used him for 4 years on exactly this kind of work. Cultural liaison, interpreter. The man who made sure both sides of the table understood each other. Or appeared to. Dara had been in this room for 40 minutes. She had already filed away, the 2 base security officers flanking the main door, positioned to see exits but not the table. Petty Officer Crane, the young aide managing the dinner, who had apologized to Dara twice already for no reason she could identify except general nervousness. Admiral Tanaka's careful, watchful stillness. Commodore Mori's habit of touching the contract folder in front of him every few minutes, as if reassuring himself it was still there. She had also filed away Harwick's hands. She told herself the filing was habit. 4 years in blue scrubs had not entirely erased 6 years of watching rooms the way rooms need to be watched when your life depends on what you don't miss. She had tried very hard to let the habit go. She had not entirely succeeded. Crane circled the table with a decanter, refilling glasses ahead of the toast. Harwick moved to assist with the water service, which was not his role. He lifted the Admiral's glass, poured, and set it back. The contact lasted less than 2 seconds. To anyone watching, it was a small, helpful gesture from a man accustomed to making himself useful. To Dara, it was something else. She had sat in a briefing room in Seoul 6 years ago and watched a video of exactly that motion. The lateral brush of a thumb across a glass rim. The pressure that deposits a microcrystalline compound so light it evaporates before a forensic kit can touch it. And she had written a field advisory about it afterward that she doubted anyone had read. She kept her eyes on the glass. Kessler's water glass sat at his right hand untouched, catching the light off the harbor. Admiral Tanaka asked Harwick something in Japanese, just between the two of them. Dara's Japanese was not good. Her East Asia work had been Korean-focused, and Japanese she had picked up only in fragments from briefings and layovers, and the particular kind of attention that people in her former line of work paid to languages without being asked to. She caught enough. Tanaka had asked about the operational sovereignty clause, specifically the duration. Harwick's answer came fluently, warmly, with the practiced confidence of a man explaining something simple. 18 months, advisory in nature. Japan retains full flexibility to reassign technology partnerships within the first year and a half. Dara had read the contract summary. She had read it because she had a habit of reading everything handed to her in rooms she was expected to be invisible in, and because the last time she had not read something carefully enough, a man named Park Ji-won had trusted her with his life and she had given it back to him, broken without meaning to. The contract did not say 18 months. The contract said 5 years, joint oversight, no unilateral reassignment. What Harwick had just told Admiral Tanaka was not a translation error. Dara's jaw tightened, her hands, folded over the trauma kit strap, did not move. She was a corpsman. She was assigned to be here in case someone had a cardiac event. She was not supposed to speak unless someone bled, and she was supposed to be the last voice in this room that anyone listened to about the language in a defense contract. Kessler lifted his water glass for the toast. She counted the steps between her position and his chair, 9. She had already counted them twice. To the partnership, Kessler said, and his voice carried the comfortable authority of a man who had never once doubted the room was listening. Tanaka echoed him in Japanese. Harwick translated it smoothly back to English, beaming with the particular warmth of a man who has already arranged the ending. Kessler drank. Dara watched the glass come down. For 30 seconds, nothing happened. Then Kessler set the glass wrong. Too far right, catch a edge of the tablecloth, and his hand didn't pull back the way hands pull back. It stayed. His fingers spread slightly. His expression shifted in the small, specific way. Expressions shift when the body sends a message the brain hasn't processed yet. He tried to make a joke, something about the time zone change. The words came out one syllable behind where they should have been. Commodore Mori noticed first. He leaned toward Tanaka and said something Dara couldn't catch. Crane was already on his feet. I'll get Dr. Slade. Lieutenant Commander Slade arrived from the anteroom in under a minute, the base physician assigned to the event, carrying a clinical bag and the focused frown of someone whose training was about to tell him something useful. He checked Kessler's pupils, grip strength, asked him to squeeze both hands. The left was fine, the right barely closed. Facial asymmetry, Slade said, mostly to himself, unilateral hand weakness, speech lag. He reached for his radio. I'm calling a stroke code. Get me a gurney. Dara's whole body went the specific kind of still that it had gone once upon a time in rooms with no names on any declassified map. It wasn't a stroke. She knew what a stroke looked like. She had managed 3 of them in 4 years of hospital work. In a stroke, the hand and the face went together, one side at a time, simultaneous. Kessler's hand had locked before his face by nearly a full minute, and his skin had gone damp at the temples in the fast, shallow way of someone whose autonomic system was responding to a surface-level compound, not a vascular event deep in the brain. She had written the field advisory. She had read it so many times after Seoul that she had eventually memorized it, because that was what her brain did with things she wished she'd caught sooner. It's not a stroke, she said. Nobody looked at her. Slade was already calling the timeline into his radio, doing exactly what his training told him to do for exactly the wrong emergency. The nurse from the base medical team was prepping a standard cardiac protocol kit. Aspirin, IV line. The beginning of a treatment plan that would interact very badly with what was already working its way through Kessler's system. Dara crossed the 9 steps she had already counted. Don't push anything yet, she said, loud enough to cut across Slade's radio call. Slade turned. He looked at her the way physicians look at corpsmen who speak out of turn. Ma'am, I need you to. His hand locked before his face did, Dara said. By over a minute. That's not how stroke's present. Check the rim of his water glass. Slade stared at her. Not the wine, the water. Right-hand side. Check the rim. Crane was the one who moved. He picked up the glass carefully with a napkin, tilted it toward the harbor light, and went still. There's something on here, he said. Like, I don't know, a film. Slade's expression shifted from annoyed to uncertain, which was progress. It's a contact agent, Dara said. She said it the way she used to say things in rooms that needed certainty more than they needed explanation. Absorbed through skin and lip contact. It mimics early stroke presentation, but it's not neurological. Standard cardiac or stroke protocol will accelerate the absorption. You will make this worse. The room had gone the particular kind of quiet that happens when something shifts, and everyone feels it before they understand it. Slade took one step toward her. Who are you? Check between his second and third fingers on the right hand, Dara said instead of answering. He may have touched the rim when he set the glass down. There'll be faint redness, already deepening. Slade checked. He found it. The silence in the room changed quality entirely. What do we use? Slade said, and the question came out different from his previous ones. Flat, direct, the voice of a physician who has made the decision to trust someone he doesn't understand yet. DMC chelation, Dara said. Oral if his airway's clear. If he can't swallow IV demercaprol, 0.5 milligrams per kilogram, watch his blood pressure closely. Demercaprol drops it fast. You don't carry demercaprol in a standard event kit. Call the base pharmacy directly. Tell them field exposure protocol, compound class 4, they'll know. Slade was already on the radio, his voice entirely different now. Harwick had not moved. He stood near the head of the table with his hands folded and his expression composed, watching Dara the way people watch something they're calculating, not the way people watch something that frightens them. The distinction had always mattered in her experience. She's guessing, Harwick said pleasantly into the silence. Adrenaline, instinct, medical staff sometimes. I'm not guessing, Dara said. Every head turned. She was still crouched beside Kessler's chair, 2 fingers light on his wrist, timing his pulse against the mental clock she had never entirely stopped running. She looked up. The compound on that glass is a fluorinated chelate suspension, she said. It was used in 3 documented field operations in the Western Pacific between 2016 and 2019. It requires specific chelation and specific sequencing. DMSA first, activated charcoal only if absorption is under 40 minutes and the airway is fully clear. No catecholamines of any kind, or you drive the compound deeper into tissue. She held Harwick's eyes. I know that because I wrote the exposure briefing for a DIA joint program that studied it 6 years ago in Seoul. The silence landed differently this time. Tanaka had gone very still. Commodore Mori's hand rested flat on the contract folder, not clutching it, just resting there, the stillness of a man who is reordering a great deal of information very quickly. You're a corpsman, Slade said, not an accusation, more like a man checking his own math. Tonight I am, Dara said. She used Kessler's first name within the next 30 seconds, the same way she had been trained to anchor a patient to something human when the chemical fog starts closing in. James, in for 4, out for 4. Stay with me. Kessler's eyes, glassy at the edges, found her face and held on, because command voice works even when the brain is fighting chemistry, and he was, at his core, a man who had spent 40 years responding to it. The base pharmacy confirmed the protocol in under 4 minutes. The DMSA arrived in 7. During those 7 minutes, Harwick made one casual movement toward the phone in his jacket pocket. Dara tracked it from across the room. Don't let him call out, she said quietly to the security officer nearest the door. He put that compound on the Admiral's glass. If he reaches his handler before you close the building, someone else in this facility becomes a loose end. She said it the way she had once said similar things in a safe house in Incheon. No emphasis, no drama. The voice of someone who has long since made peace with how unreasonable the reasonable things always sound. Please. The officer stepped forward and asked Harwick to keep his hands visible. Harwick's composure held for another 30 seconds. Then Kessler's breathing steadied. Audibly, the room heard it, and something behind Harwick's eyes finished a calculation. He was still holding himself together when Agent Yoon arrived from the NCIS field office, moving fast and looking at Dara like she was either a witness or a suspect and hadn't decided which. You identified a contact agent before any lab confirmation, Yoon said, notebook out. You directed the treatment protocol. Where does a corpsman learn that? Training, Dara said. That's not a complete answer. It's the only one I'm giving you while the man who poisoned a Vice Admiral is still standing in this room. Dara turned and looked at Harwick directly, speaking clearly enough for the full table. He also mistranslated the operational sovereignty clause to Admiral Tanaka. The English text specifies 5 years of joint oversight. Harwick told Admiral Tanaka it was 18 months, advisory only. She let that land. If both men had signed tonight, believing those were the same terms, Japan's legal position would have allowed them to exit the partnership in 18 months, citing breach of understood agreement. The contract dies. The sonar program stalls. Someone else fills that gap. Tanaka turned to Harwick. The question he asked in Japanese was short and very quiet. Harwick's answer was too quick, too smooth, and in the middle of it, Tanaka's expression changed. Not to confusion, but to a specific, cold recognition. He held up one hand and Harwick stopped talking. In English, to Kessler, who was sitting up now, color returning, right hand held carefully flat against his thigh, Tanaka said, "I did not understand the clause correctly. I will need to review the original language before anything is signed." Kessler looked from Tanaka to Harwick to Dara. "Who exactly are you?" he asked. His voice was steadier than it had any right to be given the last 30 minutes. Dara looked at Harwick, whose composure was coming apart one syllable at a time. "Someone who needs everyone in this room to stop talking about the contract," she said, "and start talking about who sent him." They found the handler 20 minutes later at the loading dock behind the kitchen service entrance. He had been posing as part of a backup catering crew, not the company that had actually catered the dinner, but one whose credentials someone had inserted into the base clearance system 6 weeks earlier. Patient work. The kind of patience that belongs to programs, not individuals. Dara went through the service door low and fast, Crane a half step behind her trying to keep up, and she covered the distance before the man had fully cleared the folding chair he'd been sitting in. She didn't reach for his weapon. She redirected his arm at the wrist, used his own pivot against him, and put him against the cold concrete wall with enough control that he had time to understand exactly what had happened before the NCIS backup came through the door behind her. Yoon stared at her across the man now zip-tied on the dock floor. "Where did you learn that?" she asked. Dara was breathing hard, her hands were steady. "Defense Intelligence Agency," she said. "East Asia Division, 6 years. It landed in the loading dock the way those things always land, heavily in a space that had gotten very quiet. Back inside, Harwick had stopped performing innocence. He sat at the table with the contract folder still open in front of him, and when Dara walked back through the door with Yoon and 2 additional agents behind her, something in him that had been held by the pretense simply released. "A Chinese procurement front," he said, without being asked, almost with relief at finally saying it out loud. "Not the ministry directly. You'd never trace it that cleanly. They've been working this partnership for 2 years. They didn't want the contract killed outright. Killing it looks intentional. They wanted it to sign under false terms, hold 18 months, then collapse from the inside. A disagreement about what both sides thought they'd agreed to." He paused, cleaner. "The trust doesn't just break. It looks like it was never real to begin with." "And the Admiral," Tanaka said, his voice controlled and very cold. Harwick looked at Kessler. "You were supposed to be impaired, embarrassed. A story about American command failures during a sensitive signing, not dead. The compound was calculated for impairment. I didn't know you would react the way you did. The dosage profile." He stopped. "You didn't know," Dara said, "because you trusted someone else's chemistry without understanding it yourself." Harwick didn't answer. Kessler was quiet for a moment. Then he looked at Dara with the expression of a man watching his own certainties rearrange themselves into a shape he hadn't expected. "You're the corpsman who's been standing against that wall all evening," he said. "Yes, sir." "You're also the reason I'm alive, and apparently the reason this contract didn't just become an intelligence operation dressed up as a diplomatic incident." "Also, yes, sir." He closed his eyes briefly. When he opened them, something behind them had shifted into something close to embarrassment. "I believe I said something when you arrived, about the medical staff." "You did, sir. I owe you an apology that's going to take longer than tonight to get right." "You can start," Dara said, "by making sure Admiral Tanaka gets to see the actual terms of that sovereignty clause before anyone signs anything. He came here in good faith, so did you." She paused. "That matters. It's worth protecting." Tanaka stood and extended his hand to her, not to Dara. "Corpsman Nolen," he said carefully, "on behalf of my delegation, thank you." He paused. "I also misjudged this room from the moment I entered it. I am sorry for that." Dara shook his hand. Her grip did not shake at all. 3 days later, she sat across a conference table from Director Albrecht, who had come down personally from Washington with a file that was somehow thicker than 6 years of her life ought to have been. Kessler sat beside him. He had insisted on attending despite the fact that his right hand still closed more slowly than his left, and his doctor had told him twice to rest. Albrecht read from the file, East Asia Division. 6 years, the Park G1 network operational until it wasn't. Official separation for personal reasons. 4 years at a naval medical center, which the file did not mention, but which Albrecht clearly knew about because people in his position always knew the things the file chose not to say. The agency would like you back, Albrecht said. Full reinstatement. Field rank restored. We have open postings in East Asia that could use someone with your particular combination of skills. Dara looked down at her own hands resting on the table. She thought about Seoul, about Park Ji-won's face across a table very much like this one, trusting her with his life the week before he lost it. She thought about the phone call she had never been able to make to anyone because the agency doesn't do condolence calls for assets. She thought about 4 years of hospital corridors and patients who needed her present, in the room, in the daylight, in work that was real and immediate and could not be turned against anyone in the dark. No, she said, not back to the field. Kessler leaned forward. Corpsman? I'll consult, Dara said. Cases like Thursday. When the work needs someone who can read a room and read a patient at the same time and neither skill alone is enough. She looked at Albrecht. I keep my medical clearances. I keep my unit. You call me when something like Thursday comes across your desk, and I'll tell you if I can help. She paused. I hope it doesn't come across your desk often. Albrecht exchanged a glance with Kessler, then he nodded. We can work with that. Later that week, she walked back through the Naval Medical Center corridors toward the ward where her actual patients were waiting. Broken bones, post-op fevers, people who needed her there in the present tense with nothing more complicated than steady hands and the ability to explain what a medication actually does instead of reading the side effect list off a clipboard. Commodore Mori was waiting near the main entrance in civilian clothes, carrying a flight back to Yokosuka in 2 hours. He held out a small box. Admiral Tanaka asked me to deliver this personally, he said, unofficial. The formal record of this week is that a medical response team handled a routine episode during a procurement event and a security review is ongoing. He gave her a look that said he knew exactly how much of the truth that sentence contained, but this is from him. Inside the box was a small pin, the anchor and cherry blossom emblem of the Japan Maritime Self-Defense Force, personal, the kind of thing exchanged between people who want to acknowledge something the paperwork will never fully reach. He said to tell you, Commodore Mori continued, that in 20 years of working with the American military, he has never seen someone do 3 different jobs at once with that quality of quiet. Dara looked at the pin for a long moment. Please thank him, she said, and tell him, I made sure Petty Officer Crane confirmed the corrected sovereignty clause was attached to the formal revised draft before it went out. The right terms, 5 years, joint oversight, exactly what it was always supposed to say. Mori nodded. He started down the corridor, then stopped. I served alongside a DIA liaison officer in 2017, he said. He moved through rooms the way you do. He retired early. I always wondered about people who left that kind of work. He paused. I think I understand it a little better now. He walked away, and Dara stood in the flat afternoon light of the building she had come to every day for 4 years, holding a pin from a government that officially did not know her name, in a hallway belonging to one that officially had never fully let her go. Harwick's case was already moving through federal channels. The front company would issue a carefully worded denial, and the denial would probably survive the news cycle. That was how these things went. The important part was what hadn't survived. The mistranslated contract, the contact on the glass rim, the 2 years of patience that had come apart in a dining room because someone's hands moved wrong at exactly the wrong moment in front of exactly the wrong person. She pushed through the ward door and found Crane waiting with a chart and the apologetic expression he seemed to have made permanent. Lieutenant Deering in room 6 is asking for you specifically, he said. Says you're the only one who explains what the medications actually do instead of just listing side effects and hoping for the best. Dara took the chart. She had spent 4 years trying to keep the 2 halves of who she was from touching each other. The woman who had once read rooms for a living, and the woman who had chosen to heal people in them instead. She had told herself they were separate things. Thursday night had proven they weren't, and maybe had never been. The same hands that had put a trained operative against a loading dock wall had spent 4 years adjusting IV lines and checking pulses at 3 in the morning and saying the right thing to people who had run out of right things to hear. Those weren't different skills. They were the same skill, learned in different rooms, under different names, at different costs. And it had taken someone trying to poison a vice admiral for her to finally stop being ashamed of having learned them both. She had always been paying attention. In every room, under every cover, in every corridor of this building, she had walked for 4 years pretending she was only one thing. The only question that had ever mattered was what you chose to do when the moment finally arrived that needed the truth of you instead of the version of yourself you'd gotten comfortable hiding behind. She already knew her answer. She walked into room 6.